So last time we discussed how secular history and archaeology coincides with what is, by the way, Nathan, this is where you can start. All right, so there's a long introduction. I'm going to start over again. Last week we discussed how secular history and archaeology coincides with what is written in the pages of the Old Testament. Often, in fact, the Bible points out new discoveries that archaeologists and historians didn't know about and they didn't think existed until they find them, and then they know that the Bible was right. These are some of the ones that we talked about last time. There's ancient writings, and there's steels and prisms, and tablets and bulas, all with references to things that happened in the Bible and are written in the Old Testament. We went through an extensive list of these last time. And it kind of gives a impression that when the Bible is speaking, it's telling the truth. And one of our points, we have said this over and over again from the beginning of this series. There is no way any of this can be totally proven beyond the shadow of doubt. But neither can the evolutionary process, because nobody was there. So we have to look at the evidence. And one of the things that I think are important in the evidence is that if the Bible or any book is telling the truth, then we need to be able to verify some of the things it says to see whether it's accurate. So if the things were not accurate, we just throw it out. Okay? But so far, we found a lot of things where the Bible says something and it proves to be accurate, even if other people, other fields like archaeology and history thought it wasn't. It proves to be accurate. We must keep in mind that history and archaeology are not why the Bible is written. It's not a history book and it's not an archaeology book. We said it's a story. We're going to get into that in a future lesson, more about what that story is and how that story is constructed. I think you were here for a part of that. We're going to get into that more even in the near future. It's not what it is. But the thing of it is, when it does speak of places and events and cities and countries, it's accurate. Which means that it's not a fiction versus nonfiction. It's not a fiction book. Because the stuff that's in it's not fiction. All right? Can we show every single thing in it is not fiction? No, because historically speaking, there are some things in there that, in archaeologically, we haven't found. Okay? You can't find everything that happened 3,000 years ago. You can't do it. But the stuff we do find crosses over and shows that it is true. So we can assume that the other stuff would probably be true also. Now, I want you to keep in mind, I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes a little bit more, that books like the Quran and the Vedas and the books of the Buddha and some of the other ancient religions, they don't do this. They don't have these accuracies. They don't even tell a story most of the time. They might tell a little bit of a story here and a little bit of a story there, but they don't tell one long continuous story, and the stuff is not verifiable in those books like it is in the Bible. Here are a few examples of, we're going to give a few more examples of the Bible's accuracy. This first one is a partial list of people that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Okay, now if you think that's not very many, it's not, because there's more pages. Okay? These are people that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Oh, going the wrong way. These are people that are mentioned in the Old Testament that they can find historical writings that reference them. Okay? This is the person. This is the who they are. This is when they live. This is when the New Testament refers to them. And this is where they find the information about that same person in the archaeological finds and in the writings of the time when they lived. And there are bunches of them. This is actually, I don't think, the entire list of people. All right? The next one here is a partial list of nations that are found in the Bible that they know exist. And the Bible talks about them, and So does the archaeological and historical references in outside the Bible. Okay, they all of these. There's 33 here, and this again is a partial list. And this next one is a list of cities that are in both the Old Testament and the New Testament that are found in archaeology. All right? Some of them they know exist and they haven't found them. Some of them they found them and they know that they exist and they're in both the Bible and the Old Testament or the New Testament. So we're not talking about a fly-by-night book here that's just making up stuff. All right? The people that wrote this knew about these places, knew what happened, knew the customs, and knew some of the very people that we're talking about. As we talked about last week, there were some of the major kings of Babylonia and some of these other nations, Assyria, etc., that the Bible makes mention of as interacting with Israel. And at the same time, we know that these were definite kings and things that really existed. We listed a whole bunch of those. In fact, this is a list of just kings. Some of them, the ones that, I believe the ones that are underlined, no, there are other ones. Some of these are ones that are Jewish kings in the Old Testament, and some of these are kings that are not kings of Israel, but this whole list of 50 show up both in the Bible and they show up in the secular writings. It's 50 kings. That's a lot. So we got So we got 330 cities, we got 33 nations, we've got 50 kings that we know about, we've got over 80 individuals, all mentioned in both places. I don't know if you think that's a lot, but that's actually an incredible amount. Like I said before, other religions don't do this. So we take the Quran. It does not present itself as a story like the Bible does. The Bible is one, we're going to look at this in just a second, it's one long story from Genesis all the way to Revelation, especially from Genesis all the way through to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. It's one long history over thousands of years. It's not individual stories that have nothing to do with each other like it is in other places. So, although the Quran, which is the book of Islam, tells a few short stories about certain people, its primary focus is guidance, and that's all it is. In fact, in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 185, it says, at the mouth of Ramadan, and I'm not pronouncing that right, I apologize, is that in which was revealed the Quran as a guidance for the people. Okay, that's what it's for. That's all it's for. That's not the primary purpose of what the Bible's for. We haven't gotten much into that yet, but it's a little bit different than that. When we look at the Vedas, which is a Hindu book, their main Hindu book, there are actually several. It's not a story at all. There are a couple of other Hindu epics about specific gods and heroes, but most of them just contain songs and philosophy and hymns and poems and ritual formulas, etc. All right? And if you've never had a chance to read some of the Quran or to read some of the Vedas, do it. As a younger man, I wanted to know whether or not I thought the Bible was true. I started reading them. All right? I read a fair amount of the Quran. I didn't read all the Vedas because it is thousands of pages long. Okay? But I read enough of it to make my choice. Buddhism is not really a single book, but they do have what's called a Tripitaka, which is a collection of teachings of Buddha. All right? No historical evidence in any of these to see whether or not they're fact or not. It's just a bunch of wise sayings. And Shinto, same sort of thing. Stories of Japanese myths and legends. But the Bible is different. It's one long story. it is verifiable, so that story becomes nonfiction rather than fiction. And the Bible is written in such a way that it assumes that it tells historical truth. It doesn't even make any apologies for it. That's actually quite important. One of the things that's interesting in the Bible, and I studied this for a lot of my life and never really picked up on it, even though I knew it was true. So I'm going to share something with you that I learned probably only a couple of years ago, or at least I finally realized over just a couple of years ago, that I think is really important. In the Old Testament, when one book ends, the next book starts in the same spot. Now that probably is obvious, but if you don't think about it that way, you don't understand. You just study maybe the book of 1 Samuel by itself and think that it's a story that's just outlier there, and it's just a story about what happened in 1 Samuel. And you don't think about what happened with the book after and the book before. All right? So, here we got Genesis chapter 50. The very end of it summarized, this is a summarization. Joseph stayed in Egypt, told his brothers that God will take care of them and get them out of Egypt in the promised land. And then we find that Joseph died. All right? That's what happened at the very ending of Genesis. Okay? Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 1. First, it gives us a list of the sons of Israel, all right, which they'd already given us in the end of Genesis. And then it says, now Joseph and all his brothers and that generation died. So, in between the two, they all died. Now it's 400 years later, and it picks up with what happens next in the book of Exodus. We get to the book of Exodus, and at the end, so the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle. The second half of Exodus is about the building of the tabernacle. It's a story that maybe happened only within a couple-week period of time, starting in chapter around 21 or so to the end. So what we got is the idea of the tabernacle, that there was a cloud and God was in it, above it. And in the beginning of Leviticus, the next book, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from that tabernacle. It's like the next day, going from the end of Exodus to the first part of Leviticus. It's not a separate book. It's just changing the emphasis. Then in the next one, we've got the end of Leviticus. Israel is at Mount Sinai receiving the law. It says in the last verse there, these are the commands of the Lord given in Mount Sinai. And in the beginning of Numbers, they are still at Mount Sinai. And Numbers, the first verse says, God spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai. Deuteronomy. Okay? Moses dies at the end. Joshua, after the death of Moses, picks up the next day. Joshua, at the end of Joshua, son of Nun, died. And then in Judges, the next book, after the death of Joshua, it's the next day. All right? Judges. At that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to the tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. And then 1st and 2nd Samuel picks right up in the story with Hannah, son of the mother of Samuel, which leads Israel to getting their first two kings. The end of Samuel, David is king, 2nd Samuel, and the last chapter is a list of David's mighty men. And then at the beginning of 1 Kings, it says David was very old. Boom, 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 boom. What's important about this? They weren't all written by the same person. The Bible's one story, even though it was written by about 40 people, over a time span of about 1,500 years, talking about at least 6,000 years of history. And yet, it meshes together like it's one book. Did we mention George Lucas the week you were here?
I think we did, yeah.
Yeah. The idea that he wrote Star Wars over a 40 or 50 year period of time.
Yeah.
And if one person hadn't done that, then it wouldn't be a cohesive beginning to end story, even specifically because it was all out of place. Yeah. And that the Bible is written that way, only it isn't over 40 or 50 years, it's written over 1,500 years. not by just George Lucas, but by 40 different authors. That doesn't seem possible to me unless it was written by and guided by somebody outside of space and time. And that's what I think is important about this. All right, that makes sense so far. This is the way that the Bible is written instead. We're going to talk about this in another time, but I want you to notice a couple of things here. First of all, there are some Bible books that are not in place, but they still tell the story in an orderly way if you know where to put them. And those are mostly the prophets. So that in this area here, where you've got the kings, all right, when it talks in the Kings about Ahab, Elijah was the prophet. When it talks about Jehoram, Elisha was the prophet. When it talks about Jeroboam the second, Jonah was the prophet. When you drop down to the other kingdom here, you got the same thing going on. Each one of those prophets in the Old Testament is prophesying, is telling things to Israel and telling things to those kings at a time in that story. It's just they are separate books because they don't mix those up. But it still makes for an entire story from beginning to end if you know where to place them. Right? They lived at those specific times. We're going to see a lot more of this in future lessons, but because of the nature of certain Old Testament books, the biggest one is Isaiah. People said, it's obvious when you read Isaiah that Isaiah is telling about some future things that actually take place. A lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it has to do with the Messiah, it has to do with Jesus. Okay, if Isaiah was written before Jesus, how did Isaiah know that those things were going to happen? Because Isaiah was written several hundred years before. So what they said for a long time, people that didn't want to believe the Bible, they said that Isaiah was written after Jesus. So it sounds like it's prophecy, but it's actually just a book that somebody wrote to make it sound like prophecy, but it's actually just a recounting of what happened. Until, you know the answer to this, I know you before I even asked the question. Okay? Until they found something in the 1940s called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of a lot of different kinds of Jewish books. But in it were complete, sometimes multiple copies of the entire Old Testament except one book. I forget, was it Ruth? It was one of them. I think one of them was missing.
Esther, I think.
Might have been Esther. The thing of it is that in the case of Isaiah, there were quite a few, and some of them were copies of copies that were dated to be at least 200 BC. It is impossible for Isaiah to have been written after Jesus because they have copies of it that were 200. So at least it was before 200 BC, which still makes it prophecy, which still makes it things that were told ahead of time that couldn't have been known by the person that wrote it. You don't hear that in your history class because it's not politically correct to believe that. So this is important. We're going to talk about this at a future date. Not only that, you can find lists of these. These are the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom. The dates when we know that they lived, the years that they reigned. In every one of these, in the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, it tells that it took the throne. He took the throne here. He reigned he was born here. It took the throne here. He reigned for so many years, and he died when he was this old. So it's given us very specific information about each one of them, one after another after another. These are the kings of the northern kingdom. Same thing. Number of years, dates, and where they're referred to. And then this is the prophets. This is just another way of looking at those previous two charts. This is the prophets, whether it was Judah or Israel, whether or not which prophets prophesied to those specific things, the dates, and the prophet's date of birth. So it's one long story. It's one long historical story because we're finding a lot of things that are accurate about it, and it's nonfiction, right? It's not what it's being made out to be by a lot of people that don't want to believe the Bible. So, we have history also in the New Testament. Now, let me find where I was talking about here. Good. Going back one slide, when you get right here, there is a 400-year gap between when the end of the Old Testament happened and when Jesus came. All right? It's almost like whoever wrote it did that to show off. Because there's not like a next day like there was in all those other books we looked at. It's like making it even harder, because if everything was definitely 400 years earlier or before, then there's no way in the world that people that wrote any of this stuff could talk to the people that wrote this stuff. That's kind of amazing when you think about it. All right? So, who was it that, what are the history books of the New Testament? There's actually 5 main ones. They're easy. It's the first 5. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. Okay? Those are the history books. The other ones have some history in it, but those are basically the main 5 history books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell about one story. All right? And then Luke tells about the story of Jesus. When he was born, his life, how he died, resurrected. Which is all important to the story because that's what the whole Old Testament was about. We're going to get into that more later also. And then there's Acts that tells what happened that the apostles did after Jesus died. And it lasts from just after Jesus died to somewhere in the vicinity of 60 some AD. So about a 30-year period of time, I think, 35, somewhere in there. It's not 40, I know that. Okay, it tells that history. There is one author that actually tells all that history from beginning to end and tells it's half of the history books. And that's which one? Which one of those 4 people? Luke. Luke wrote the book of Luke, the gospel about Jesus, and he wrote the history of what happened afterwards, the book of Acts. So he's got the whole story. And I've got theories as to why he wrote it the way he did. This isn't the class to get into it, but it's really kind of interesting to see why he probably wrote those. I still think, and I read a book about this not long ago, this is just a side note, I think it was as a treaty for Paul, a 2-part treatise for Paul, to explain to the people that were going to be in the courts where Paul came from and why he was being persecuted. I think that's the reason why there's a whole book on that. If I can remember what it is, I'll send you the link.
Yeah.
Okay, it's an interesting book, and I really kind of think that might be true. It explains a lot, especially towards the end, and why it ends where it ends.
I never thought about that before.
Okay, I hadn't either until about less than 10 years ago. Okay, all right. Side note, you guys don't need to know what we're talking about. We're going to get back to what we're talking about now. So, we got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. Luke wrote about 1/4 of the New Testament, but when you talk about just the history books, those first 5, he wrote almost half. It's 40-some% of the history. So I got a question here. And this looks like it's out of order. Now, many of the things Luke wrote are challenged by historians because they, especially from the past, because they did not think Luke could be correct. But, just like we discussed about some of the Old Testament history, little by little over the years, Luke's writings have proved to be highly accurate. When I was going to college, my first year, I took a history class, ancient world history, from a guy with about 200 other students in a big auditorium. I don't remember anything about that except one statement that professor made, because it stuck out to me like a sore thumb. Now, he wasn't a believer, obviously, from his statement. Okay, he was probably an atheist. He never said that, I don't know that, but I'm assuming because of how he made the statement. And when he said this, my ears perked up. Even though I wasn't that interested in history at the time, this was an interesting statement. And this is not exact, but it's pretty close. He said, Luke is a very accurate historian. If Luke says it, then it's true. But there is a problem with Luke, and that is that he is too charismatic. And then he went on, kept teaching the course. So this guy is relying on Luke's accuracy for the things he's teaching in a secular ancient world history course. Because Luke's telling the truth. What did he mean by saying that Luke was too charismatic? You know what the word charismatic means? When you're talking about religion, charismatic is a derogatory term by some people that give the impression that there's these spiritual things going on, miracles and belief in God and that sort of thing. And Luke was crazy when he wrote about those things, but his history is right. That's what the guy was saying in that statement. Why would he say that? And I think it goes back to a quote that I have used several times in this class so far, but since the only one that's been here for it is Grace, I'm going to put it up here on the screen again. George Wald won the Nobel Prize in Science in 1966 or 67, forget which year now. Real smart guy, okay? And he was standing before a bunch of atheistic scientists and said this: when it comes to the origin of life on Earth, there is only two possibilities, either creation or spontaneous generation. And in the first half of this class, we dealt a lot with spontaneous generation. It was disproved over 100 years ago. And that means that there's something that doesn't and hasn't ever lived, and all of a sudden, poof, flies, rats, larvae. In other words, it just spontaneously starts life. All right? They know that doesn't happen. But what he's saying is that if evolution is true, then they have to believe in spontaneous generation, because what it was at the beginning wasn't a mind, it was like just matter, like a rock. And somehow or another, a rock or a gas turned into our minds that we can think through chemistry and electricity. Evolutionists that are atheists have to believe that. Whether they want to admit it or not, there is no other choice. And George Wald is saying that. So there's only two possibilities. Either there was creation or there was spontaneous generation. He said no third choice. Spontaneous generation was disproved over 100 years ago, but that leads us to only one other conclusion, and that is a supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we believe the impossible. What's the philosophical grounds that he's talking about? It's that we can't believe in a God because we don't want to. That's the very essence of all of this. All right? Can I prove that there's a God? No. But I can mount the evidence in such a way that says, Occam's razor says, it has to be this way because it can't be any other. And if you doubt that, watch the first 17 or 18 episodes that I've done so far in this class. Okay? Because I give a lot of evidence. Not because I'm smart, because I know the people that I think are smart enough to figure this out. A lot of them they're all PhDs, just like the atheist ones are PhDs. Okay? So, I think this is all important. Here is a partial list of the people who Luke writes about. And I must have mixed this slide up. We're going to talk about several of these things. So, all right, let's start out with this one. We know that Matthew and Luke are the Gospels that give an account of the birth of Jesus. Okay? Both of them tell about Jesus being born. Luke actually gives the most details on it. Okay? One of the things that's talked about in the details in Luke is the idea that Jesus was raised in one place, but born in a different place. Where was he born? Where was he raised? You know either one of those? He was raised in Nazareth, but because there was a census going on, census means counting of the people in the Roman Empire, or even nowadays, because there was a census going on, they forced the people to go back to the city that they were actually from in order to be counted. So Mary and Joseph had to travel down to Bethlehem near Jerusalem to be counted. And Jesus ended up being born there. All right? This is important. It's not just a cool story. We're going to show you why this is important to what we're talking about. In fact, Luke says, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman Empire. This was in the first century census that took place while this guy was governor of Syria. Notice how Luke is pinpointing when this was. He doesn't use a date because over the years he knows that the dating systems are going to be different. But he puts people in there that they're going to be able to find in archaeology so that they know when it actually would have happened. And they know these people. They know when this happened. And everyone went to their own town to register. The problem is this, that for a long time people thought that this was nuts. There's no way in the world, anybody in the history of the world would have ever done a census like this. And they ridiculed Luke for it. Liberal Bible scholars criticized Luke and said that this couldn't happen until they found a discovery in 1905. It was from a particular government official in Egypt that was dated to around 100 AD. So this would have been about 60 years or so after Jesus died, somewhere in that vicinity. Here's what it said. That's the guy's name, Perfect of Egypt, that tells his title, gives notice. The enrollment by household being at hand, it is necessary to notify all who, for any cause whatsoever, are outside of their nomes. In other words, they have moved to some other place from where they were born. That's what those outside your nomes means. To return to their domestic hearths, which means go back to the place where you were born, that they may also accomplish the customary suspension of enrollment. So in other words, 50, 60 years later, they were still doing the same practice that Luke was talking about, so it's not crazy, and Luke was right. There's another reason. This is all tied together. It's really cool. Back in Micah, remember the Old Testament? This is an Old Testament prophet. It says, "But you, O Bethlehem, who are the least to be among the clans of Judah, for you shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from the ancient of days." Who are they talking about? Go ahead and say it. I can see it's on your lips. Who's Micah talking about? He's talking about Jesus. Now, they didn't know it when Micah wrote that. And Micah wrote over 400, 500 years before Jesus was born. This is why the Pharisees had such a problem. One of the reasons why the Pharisees had such a problem with Jesus. Because they knew Micah said he was going to come from Bethlehem, but he was raised in Nazareth, and they didn't go back and look in their own records to see that he was actually born where Micah said he was going to be. I find this to be amazing for a lot of different levels. Micah could not have known that Jesus was going to be raised in Nazareth. He couldn't even have known that he was going to be raised in or born in Bethlehem. But everything worked out so that this came true. We're going to look at a lot of predictions the Old Testament makes about various things and show how This happens over and over and over again, and yet it's ignored by even religious people a lot of times. Luke makes references to 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands, and there's no mistakes in any one of them. They're all there, they all were real. He knows the customs, he knows how they would have spoken about these places when they're going there and the routes they would have taken. They know this is all true nowadays. They didn't maybe for a long time, but they do now. Luke's accuracy of these kinds of things and his ability to outwit the skeptics, it would take several months for us to actually go through everything in the books of Acts and Luke and Acts to cover all the details. There are so many. Like this history professor said, we can rely on it. So it's nonfiction. Not just the Old Testament, the New Testament. It's nonfiction. Here's another one that's kind of cool. When people died in New Testament times, their bodies were not mummified, but they were they had a process that they did to them, and then they were placed someplace for a period of about a year. And what happened during that year was the body decayed to the point where all that was left was the bones. Then after a year, they went and they got the bones and they put them in a box like this. They were called ossuaries, which basically means a bone box. And then that was put in a family sepulcher with all the bones of all the relatives that had died that they knew. All right? They found a lot of these ossuaries. Listen to this. In 1973, some ossuaries were found in a first century cave near Bethany. Some of them had names that could be made out, and also they found that are found in the New Testament, and some of the bones were etched with crosses, which means these people were identified as being Christian when they were living, believers in Jesus. Here's some of the names they found. Mary, Martha, Lazarus. All 9 names from the Bible. They were all found in one ossuary inscription of a family burial box. That's kind of amazing because they were brothers and sisters. They were related to each other. Here's another one. This is a writing on another bone box. This is the actual writing. You can't hardly see it because it's a bad picture. It reads, James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, and it says it in Aramaic. And it was found in 63 AD. Who could that even be talking about? Jesus' father was named James, and one of his brothers was named Joseph. No, sorry. Jesus' father was named James, or Joseph, and one of his brothers was named James. Impossible. Okay? Here's another. And I haven't got a real long list of these. In fact, I'm getting pretty close to done here. In Acts chapter 13, starting in verse 6, it talks about Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark on a missionary journey, and they're visiting some places like Paphos and on an island called Cyprus. There's a dramatic thing that happens during that time. We're not going to get into the story, but it's talking specifically about a Roman governor named Sergius Paulus. Guess what this stone says? It says this is the stone of Sergius Paulus, and it actually gives his government official title of proconsul on this stone. The man really existed. They found evidence of it. The Gospel of Luke, along with the book of Acts, have been shown historically accurate in this kind of respect over and over and over again. They have the correct identification of locations, the accurate description of Roman officials, the corroboration of Roman practices, and archaeological findings, all testifying to the fact that Luke is telling the truth in both of his books. Here's a few others, but I'm not going to go into each one of them. But they got Lysias, Iconium of Phrygia, and Pontius Pilate. All of these different people have proven to be true, and they've found who they are, where they live, and that Luke is right. This is only a small portion of what we've been talking about. And as we talked about last week somewhat, there is, were you here last week when we talked about Occam's razor? Yeah. You guys remember? You ever watch Big Bang Theory when they talk about Occam's razor?
Yeah.
Yeah, I showed that little clip last week. But basically, Sheldon had thrown a letter in the mail that he didn't want. I forget the other guy's name. It wasn't Howard. Anyway, he didn't want him to get. You remember?
Leonard?
Yeah, he didn't want Leonard to get the letter for whatever reason, so he threw it in there. And Leonard picks it up and says, how come this is in the trash can? And of course, Sheldon, trying to deflect, says, well, it could be that the trash can formed around the letter, But Occam's razor says that's probably not true. Occam's razor, of course, is when you have two competing theories that make exactly the same predictions, the simpler one is better. Which is better? That this was a collaboration to write an entire thing back here after the fact so that it all made sense, or that all this evidence shows that it happened in real time and that the people knew what they were talking about and they were telling the truth. Right? What I'm trying to show in the next several weeks is that I think they're telling the truth. And if that's the case, then I think we need to give more credence to the Bible and less credence to the people that don't want to believe it. Like Miller Burroughs, a Yale archaeologist, said, the excessive skepticism of many liberal theologians means that there are people that try to adhere to the Bible, but they really don't believe that the whole Bible is true. They think that a lot of it's just myth. Skepticism of liberal theologians stems not from a careful evaluation of the available evidence, but instead from an enormous disposition against the supernatural. They don't want to believe that there really is a God and that they have to actually take him serious. That's what this guy is saying. On the whole, however, archaeological work has unquestionably strengthened confidence in the reliability of the scriptural record, and it has strengthened our confidence in the accuracy with which the text has been transmitted throughout the centuries. This guy is saying what I'm more and more became convinced of as the older I got and the more I looked at this stuff. The Bible knows what it's talking about. We're going to talk about a lot more evidence over the next few weeks. All right, so if you're interested, watch them online, or even better, come on and join us.